as people are being admitted into the from the waiting room, we'll be just starting in a few moments, just allowing everybody to be having arrived. And you will have received the message in relation to the recording. I'll make a comment about that in a moment. So welcome to everybody to this, the first of our 4 Advent events, in which we look a little bit deeper into the subject of Israeli apartheid. A few housekeeping matters for you to begin with. First of all, if you would please remain unmuted, except if you're going to ask a question. When you've got quite a lot of people on Zoom, it only takes a dog barking somewhere or somebody being offered a cup of coffee and everybody else gets interrupted. So if you can keep yourselves unmuted, except when asking a question, then that would be very helpful indeed. We are recording tonight. And if, therefore, you don't want your face to be appearing on the recording, you can, of course, stop your video, and that would prevent that happening. We may well simply be recording the sound. I know we were looking into that as a possibility, but if you could turn your video off if you really don't want to be seen. The way this evening will go is that we are delighted to welcome our 2 speakers, Tony Lehrman and Stephen Sizer. Tony is going to speak first for about a quarter of an hour, and then we'll then go next to our second speaker, Stephen Sizer, and when we've heard both speakers, there will subsequently be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And so you might like to jot down things you wanted to ask. If something that is said brings something to mind and you feel you want to ask a particular question, then jot it down at that point in order to come back to it when we get to the question and answers. I will be trying to ensure that the question and answers do involve questions and are not an opportunity for additional speeches to be made. So if you could please phrase it in terms of questions in order that we can hear from our 2 speakers and we can go a little more deeply into the issues that they raise. So I think without any further ado, we will move to the 2 speakers. And I am delighted to have the opportunity to welcome Tony Lehrman to the first of our Lent studies. Tony is a British author and researcher living in London who writes on anti-Semitism, other racisms, Israel-Palestine, multiculturalism, Jewish affairs, and the place of religions in society. He's a senior fellow at the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna, an honorary fellow of the Parkes Institute for the Study of Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton, and associate editor of Patterns of Prejudice. He was the founding director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, one of the founders of the Independent Jewish Voices, and a member of the advisory committee of the Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum. He was founding editor of Anti-Semitism World Report and editor of the Jewish Quarterly for some 20 years. Author of a number of books on Zionism, Judaism, and other subjects associated with Judaism. He has written for The Independent, The Guardian, Haaretz, New York Times, New Statesman, Jewish Chronicle, and other publications. The subject that we've asked both Stephen and Tony to speak on is Zionism and Apartheid. Tony, we're delighted to welcome you. We look forward to what you're saying and would be grateful for you to speak to us now.
Thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for asking me to make this introductory talk. So let me get stuck in straight away. Although I've lived continuously now in the UK for 50 years, for me, this subject is personal. I was brought up as an Orthodox Jew, but in my teens, I became a very committed secular Zionist. I was head of what was called a socialist Zionist youth movement, which aimed to encourage young people to decide to emigrate to Israel and live on a kibbutz. One of the movement's aims was to teach by example. So I left for Israel in 1970, choosing to take immediate citizenship as allowed by the law of return for Jews. A few years later, I was back in the UK, beginning a long journey away from Zionism and seeking to understand and come to terms with the consequences of my actions and my personal responsibility for perpetuating injustice and, though this wasn't the word being used then, institutionalizing apartheid. I'm no longer a Zionist, but I have remained a citizen of the State of Israel. Much of my career has been spent thinking, researching, and writing about the issues that have troubled me ever since. The future of Jewish life, the reality of anti-Semitism today, achieving justice and peace in Palestine, Israel, and other matters. So I take as my starting point the truth of the evidence in the Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, and Amnesty reports that the Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. The crime of apartheid is defined in international law as, quote, inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another, end quote. But there was already a comprehensive report providing evidence of this. On March 15, 2017, the UN Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, UNESCO, published a report on Israeli practices towards the Palestinian people. The report, prepared by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, said that these practices could be described as racial segregation or apartheid, since Israeli policies and practices met the legal definition of the crime of apartheid as defined by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But subjected to intensive pressure, especially from the US and Israel, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres instructed UNESCO to withdraw the report from its website. And on March 17, Dr. Rima Khalaf, the Executive Secretary General of UNESCO, chose to resign. Now, the Israeli journalist, Orly Noy, who hosted the international press conference launching the Amnesty International report in February 2022, commented later, after the aggressive defensive Israeli response rooted in accusations of anti-Semitism, and I quote, official Israel seems to have gone completely off the rails, disparaging and defiling Jewish historical memory by hysterically waving the anti-Semitism card at every opportunity, using the IHRA working definition, which claims that calling the existence of Israel a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic, end quote. Israel has form in this area. When United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism is racism, was passed in 1975, opinion in Israel was also hysterical, so much so that commentators indulged in racist language to describe the African states which voted for it. Now, nothing in history is inevitable, but given insistent claims that Israel is democratic and equal, the obvious place to start is to ask whether political Zionism was inevitably going to lead to this, both ideologically and by what Zionist leaders felt was political necessity. So what did the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, say? He wrote in his diary in 1895, and I quote, "We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We should try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side, but the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." End quote. And the revisionist Zionist leader, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, godfather of the political trend that has brought Israel the far-right, racist, ethno-religious nationalist government now taking power, was quite clear in his judgment that the indigenous population was dispensable. And I quote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. Constant threat of the use of massive force against the Arab majority would be necessary to implement the Zionist program. What he called an iron wall of bayonets was an imperative for its success. Zionist colonization," he continued, "can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach." End quote. The Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi writes of this, quote, "This was still the high age of colonialism, when such things being done to native societies by Westerners were normalized and described as progress." End quote. So what about the other strains of Zionism? In the socialist Zionism I was taught, I don't recall any colonialist language of this kind. Uncompromising equality was our watchword in the youth movement. But some years later, when I was interrogating and critiquing my past beliefs, researching the history of that movement, I came across its handbook, which referred to Jaffa as having, quote, "remained enslaved for 2,000 years until it almost forgot what it was to be free," end quote, and to the Mediterranean as having, quote, "once more become what it was 2,000 years ago, simply the national Jewish sea," end quote. Zionism was clearly envisaged as being a civilizing instrument, which the Arabs should welcome because it would lift them out of squalor and poverty. But it was not the primary task of Jews to reform Arab society. Even the intending socialist Zionist pioneers realized the exclusiveness of Zionism. The Jewish emissary to the youth movement from Palestine in the 1930s said, quote, that it was necessary to drain the Arab social swamp so that the Jewish national home should be free from bad influences emanating from an unhealthy society in its midst, end quote. So if socialist Zionism, the Zionism of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, dominant from the 1920s to the 1960s, was no better than revisionist Zionism, was there any Zionism with any agency that held out the prospect of true equality? The group closest to this idea was Brit Shalom, which in the 1920s sought peaceful coexistence between Arabs and Jews to be achieved by renunciation of the Zionist aim of creating a Jewish state. The alternative vision of Zionism was to create a center for Jewish cultural life in Palestine, echoing the earlier ideas of a Zionist thinker, Achad Ha'am. At the time, Brit Shalom supported the establishment of a binational state where Jews and Arabs would have equal rights. Among its supporters and founders were the philosopher Martin Buber and Albert Einstein. A leading Zionist official who actually supported the group wrote, quote, "The Zionist aim has no equal example in history. The aim is to bring the Jews as second nation into a country which already is settled as a nation and fulfill this through peaceful means. he continued, history has seen such penetration by one nation into a strange land only by conquest, but it has never occurred that a nation will freely agree that another nation should come and demand full equality of rights and national autonomy at its side, end quote. Brit Shalom definitely offered a different kind of colonization, and at least was honest about what it wanted. But the group never had any serious political weight and had disintegrated by the early 1930s. By the 1970s, features of Israeli government policy closely resembled South African apartheid and then became more blatant. The Hebrew word hafradah, separation or segregation, was used to describe the separation on grounds of ethnicity of the Israeli population from the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. The 1950 absentee property law brought land of displaced Palestinians under state control for the benefit of Jewish-only settlement. The 1982 Identity Card Act required all people in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza over 16 to carry Israeli-issued ID, which could be used to identify their ethnicity. Between 1948 and 1967, over 1.1 million Palestinians were forcibly displaced during the 1948 Nakba and the 1967 Naksa. In 2018, during the peaceful protests of the Great March of Return in Gaza, which called for an end to the Israeli siege and return of refugees, 42 unarmed Palestinians were killed in one day. And finally, the Palestinian Authority, set up in 1995 in coordination with Israel, ostensibly governed disconnected fragments of the West Bank and Gaza, but has been unable to prevent land expropriation, racial classification, mass displacement, or violent repression, demonstrating that its independence, like the South African Bantustans, was merely token. While some may argue that Israel was initially sympathetic to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, it switched sides in 1976, after the UN Zionism is Racism resolution was passed, but even before the Israeli Labour Party lost power to Begin's revisionists. Not only did it develop very close military cooperation, selling the country arms, helping it build its own arms manufacturing capability, and even going so far as to give South Africa its nuclear weapons know-how, the two countries found ideological affinity in their determination to maintain Jewish and Afrikaner majority rule in perpetuity. The overt anti-Semitism of Forster's National Party was of little concern to the Israelis. By this time, I had left Israel and returned to the UK. The model egalitarian society of the kibbutz where I lived proved to have replaced one set of inequalities with another. Elitism of the especially male original settlers. Hired Arab labor, as it was called, was frowned upon. Relations with Palestinians who did work for the kibbutz were, in my experience, from where I worked on the banana plantation, complicated. The caretaker, a local Palestinian, lived in a hut with his large family on the plantation. For the original founders of the kibbutz, interactions with him were coolly polite, formal, transactional, wary. Not master and slave, but the strong and the weak, who, it was assumed, quote unquote, knew his place. For me as a newcomer, I was confused. Was this person a friend or an enemy? The youth movement taught us that he was mostly the enemy. Later, once I began to study racism, I realized he was the other, tolerated, both uncivilized and a danger. In the Zionist imaginary of my youth, he did not belong. Meanwhile, this separateness was reinforced starkly during my 3 months basic training in the Israeli army, where I encountered overt anti-Palestinian racism. Back in 2014, the Israeli journalist Merav Zonshine, who is now with the International Crisis Group, wrote, quote, Israeli society has been unwilling and unable to overcome an exclusivist ethno-religious nationalism that privileges Jewish citizens and is represented politically by the religious settler movement and the increasingly conservative secular right. Israel's liberal progressive forces remain weak in the face of a robust economy that profits from occupation while international action reinforces the status quo. In their attempt to juggle being both Jewish and democratic, she wrote, most Israelis are choosing the former at the expense of the latter. Almost a decade later, all these trends have intensified, such that the messianism-inflected ethno-nationalist, Jewish supremacist, discriminatory, racist Zionism that the overwhelming number of parties in the Knesset have in common, backed up by the religious authorities. The coming to power of the Netanyahu-Smotrich Ben Gvir coalition is a signal that most Jewish Israelis seem to willingly embrace apartheid, thus making any prospect of dismantling it as remote as ever. The idea that some form of liberal Zionism or socialist Zionism can currently offer any serious alternative to the status quo is simply out of the question. Moreover, in the same way that Israeli apartheid has come about through a relentless ratcheting up of the introduction of legal, administrative, and military measures that constantly reinforce and entrench the apartheid framework, the even more extreme demands for formal expulsions of Palestinians and other quote-unquote traitors could soon be on the government's agenda for implementation. Nevertheless, South African apartheid was defeated, even if stark inequalities remain. So we have to hope that a path to bringing Israeli apartheid to an end can also be found, at the same time realizing that any truly just outcome will throw up many seemingly insoluble and messy dilemmas. And here I have to say something that many may find disappointing. I think Zionism has to be part of the answer. 90% of Israeli Jews call themselves Zionists. The idea that dismantling apartheid requires the defeat of Zionism condemns Palestinians to continued apartheid. Zionist Israeli Jews will not abandon their Zionism, and to think that violent measures will bring that about is simply fanciful. I come to this as someone opposed to all kinds of tribe-purifying nationalism, which is what all nationalisms are in danger of and often prone to becoming. But I'm a pragmatist and realize that neither Palestinians nor Israeli Jews will abandon their nationalist sentiments or their belief in their right to national self-determination. I can rail about it and bemoan this fact as much as I like, but it won't make nationalism go away. So a solution to ending apartheid, achieving justice for the Palestinians, such as ending occupation, implementing the right of return, repealing all discriminatory legislation, declaring that the country belongs to all its citizens, etc., and institutionalizing equal rights for all between the river and the sea, is to make binationalism, already present in an overwhelmingly confrontational form, a shared value. But, and this is a very big but, only on the grounds of Zionists and Palestinian nationalists abandoning any exclusivist, supremacist, ethno-element in their nationalisms and embracing civic nationalism instead, which means that no group lays claim to being a numerical majority in perpetuity. How to reach the point where this could become a serious proposition is an altogether different, and for now, apparently insoluble dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. You've started our series off with considerable challenge, a great deal of information, and a lot that I'm sure people will want to come back and question you upon. So thank you for what a very informative start to our evening. If I may, then I'll turn straight away to our second speaker, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer. Stephen is the founder and director of Peacemaker Trust, a registered charity dedicated to peacemaking, especially where minorities are persecuted, where justice is denied, human rights are suppressed, or reconciliation is needed. Stephen is an Anglican priest and has served most recently as Vicar of Virginia Water until 2017. He's a trustee of a number of different charities, including a number which have interests in the Holy Land. And one of those is Sabeel-Kairos, who are, of course, hosts for our evening this evening. Stephen, in that capacity, has been one of the organisers of this series, along with Charlotte and myself. Stephen is author of 3 books, In the Footsteps of Jesus and the Apostles, Christian Zionism, Roadmap to Armageddon, and Zion's Christian Soldiers. Stephen, we look forward to your contribution towards this evening's programme. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. I just need to check that you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? You can?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Okay. It's a delight to share in the first of this 4-part series in Advent, and in particular to speak alongside Tony. And I found his presentation very helpful, and I look forward to our Q&A time afterwards. In my presentation, I want to do 3 things: look at the roots of apartheid, apartheid and Zionism, and a biblical refutation of apartheid. And alongside this series in Advent, we're providing Bible study material to help you as individuals or as a church to engage with this important, challenging subject. So let's begin by looking at the roots of apartheid. And something has gone wrong with my PowerPoint. Here we go. The roots go back really to white supremacism, European colonialism, and the development of slavery, particularly in the United States, but not exclusively there. But with the abolition of slavery, we find slavery, when it was abolished, led to segregation in the United States. Segregation along ethno-nationalist lines, if you like. Segregation in the United States had a profound influence over the rise of Aryanism in Germany. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. James Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, The United States and Making of Nazi Race Law, and Michael Pry's book, The Bible and Colonialism, are examples of books that address the link, if you like, between Aryanism in Germany and segregation in the United States. What you may not necessarily be aware of is the influence of both Aryanism in Germany and segregation in the United States in the rise of apartheid in South Africa. John Stott said this recently in one of his books: anti-Semitism in Germany and apartheid in South Africa seem at first sight so different from one another. Nevertheless, the theory of race on which both systems were built is almost identical. So is the sense which many Germans and South Africans have expressed that they are destined to rule and must at all costs preserve their racial purity. As you know, South Africa became a state in 1948, and so did Israel. And as Tony has alluded, there is a strong parallel between apartheid in South Africa and Zionism in Israel. It's that link between South Africa and Israel I want to elaborate on now and show the apartheid nature of Zionism itself. Way back in 1987, Uri Davis wrote his book, Israel, an Apartheid State, in which he catalogued ways in which Israel was increasingly manifesting similar traits to South Africa. His subsequent second book, Apartheid Israel, was published in 2003, Apartheid Israel, Possibilities for the Struggle Within. And then the subject became much more widely understood through Jimmy Carter's best-selling book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, which came out in 2007. And then Ben White's book, Israel Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide, was published in 2009. But it wasn't really until, as Tony said, 2021, when B'Tselem published a major report, This is Apartheid, a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, closely followed by Human Rights Watch's report, A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution. And then in February this year, Amnesty International published their report, Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, a Cruel System of Domination and a Crime Against Humanity. Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice published an important work, a dossier on Israeli apartheid this year as well, and we strongly commend that document to you, a pressing call to churches around the world. And in one sense, this Advent series is a response to that call. Visualizing Palestine have produced some very helpful resources to show the parallels between South African apartheid and Israel's Hafrada. Apartheid in the past tense, Hafrada in the present. Both relate to separation or segregation. On the one hand, apartheid was used to describe South Africa's state policy of segregation by race. Hafrada is a word used to describe Israel's state policy of segregation by ethnicity. Apartheid was designated a crime under the 1998 Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court and the 1973 International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. And they defined apartheid as a crime against humanity with three main elements: an intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another, a context of systematic oppression of one racial group over another, and inhuman acts by one racial group over another. And in Palestine today, we see those three elements of apartheid being implemented by Israel against the Palestinians and the annexation of Palestinian territory. The intent to dominate is clear and unequivocal. And we see the systematic oppression by Jewish Israelis and the Israeli authorities in their discrimination, in repression of Palestinians, both in the territories, East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And in this regard, we see the integrating of Jewish people into the occupied territories and the segregation of the Palestinians into the equivalent of South African Bantustans. Jeff Halper's book, The Matrix of Control, is a very helpful book detailing the matrix, the ways in which apartheid is imposed on Palestine, both in terms of the destruction of Palestinian homes, the building of Jews-only settlements, the exclusive road system for Jews only within the settlements, links them together and links them to Israel, the military checkpoints and restrictions on Palestinian movement, access to their natural resources like water, and then the separation barrier, the wall, maximizing the amount of territory being included within Israel and minimizing the Palestinian population. So I'm going to show you a few graphics that illustrate these elements: the home demolitions happening on a daily basis, the development and building of exclusive Jewish settlements on Palestinian land, the checkpoints that separate one from the other, the laws instituted to make it illegal for Israelis to enter the Palestinian territories, and the physical means by which Palestinians are restricted from entering Israel. The separation wall and the checkpoints limit the number of Palestinians who can enter into Israel essentially as day laborers. They must be out before nightfall. And of course, the separation wall, the Hafrada wall, makes that the the existence of apartheid so much more visible. That's me standing next to the wall to give an indication of the size, twice the height of the Berlin Wall. This is the road from Jericho to Jerusalem through Bethany, a historic road going back thousands of years, now blocked by the separation wall. So Hafrada, or segregation, is imposed by ethnicity, by subjugating the Palestinians and sequestrating their land, stealing the land and imposing Israeli military law upon the Palestinians. Here are just a couple of graphics from Amnesty that help visualize the fragmentation of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinian territories that has happened systematically from 1967. The roots of apartheid, apartheid and Zionism. I want to simply conclude with some examples of the way in which the scriptures refute apartheid. And the first is to emphasize that within the Hebrew scriptures, we find Israel seen as an inclusive people based on the basis of faith, not ethnicity. Psalm 87 is just one example where the Lord says, I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me, Philistia too, and Tyre along with Cush. We're dealing there with the Egyptians, the Iraqis, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, and the Africans. And God says, this one was born in Zion. The Lord will write on the register of the peoples, this one was born in Zion. Citizenship comes usually comes with the place, it comes from the place within which we are born. God is saying that the people of the surrounding nations have equal rights. It is as if they were born in Zion if they acknowledge me. Just one more example of the inclusive nature of God's people. The story of Esther tells the way in which God delivered his people from their enemies. And at the end of the story, we find this amazing verse. It says, in every province and every city, there was joy and gladness among the Jews and feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So at least from the time of Esther, Jewishness was on the basis of faith, not race. An inclusive Israel, an inclusive inheritance too, inheritance in terms of land. When God's people came back into the land from exile, God instructed them through the prophet Ezekiel, you are to allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the aliens who've settled among you who have children. You are to consider them native-born Israelites. Along with you, they are to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. In whatever tribe the alien settles, there you are to give him his inheritance, declares the sovereign Lord. I just noticed in 3 verses, God says 3 times, share the inheritance. Why would God have to say it 3 times in 3 verses? Well, for the same reason today, they don't want to share the land. An inclusive people, an inclusive inheritance, an inclusive temple. Through the prophet Isaiah, the Lord says, let no foreigner who's bound himself to the Lord say the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. Now just think about that. If the Lord says, let no foreigners say the Lord will exclude me from his people, why would foreigners say it? Presumably because the Lord's people were doing the excluding. But God says the foreigners who've bound themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So an inclusive Israel, inclusive inheritance, inclusive temple. When we come to the New Testament, we find that segregation or apartheid is rebuked quite explicitly. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he shares an incident of what happened. He says in Galatians 2, when Peter or Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in their hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, "How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ." Segregation rebuked. Because the ethnic barriers have been removed. A chapter later in Galatians 3, Paul says, "This is why I had to rebuke Peter, because there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. You are heirs according to the promise." Abraham's seed on the basis of faith, not race. And the vision that we find in the New Testament is that God is building one new humanity made up of all peoples, all ethnicities, all races. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, says his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, the two being Jews and Gentiles, in one body, to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. And right at the end of the Bible, in Revelation, we find this glorious vision. The Apostle John says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." This is a taster, if you like, for a biblical refutation of apartheid, which you can elaborate on and explore further through the Bible study, which sits alongside these presentations. An inclusive Israel, inclusive inheritance, inclusive temple, segregation rebuked, ethnic barriers removed, one new humanity. We've looked at the roots of apartheid, apartheid and Zionism, and a brief biblical refutation of apartheid. At last year's annual conference, we addressed apartheid, and the conference statement said this: "Having considered a Christian response to Israeli apartheid, we affirm that all people are created equally in the image of God, and we commend the B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch documents designating Israel as an apartheid state. We repudiate all forms of racism and discrimination, and we recommit ourselves to working for justice, peace, and reconciliation in Israel-Palestine." To my knowledge, that was the first declaration by a Christian organization acknowledging Israel to be an apartheid regime and dedicating itself to repudiating racism and discrimination manifest there. If you want to know more, explore more about the subject, and particularly the way in which Christian Zionists, who outnumber Jewish Zionisms at least 10 to 1, undergird and defend and support and justify apartheid in Israel, then you can check out my books and resources on my website, stephensizer.com. But let me conclude with a quote from Desmond Tutu. He said this, and this is the challenge for us today: "The end of apartheid stands as one of the crowning accomplishments of the last century, but we would not have succeeded without the help of international pressure. If apartheid ended, so can the occupation, but the moral force and international pressure will have to be just as determined. The current divestment effort is the first, though certainly not the only, necessary move in that direction." Challenging apartheid in Advent. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We've had two excellent presentations and very different, very complementary. So thank you, Stephen, for following Tony's speech with something that informed us in a different way, and particularly I found very helpful your reminders of the biblical refutation of apartheid. So we're moving to the part of the evening when we share in question answers. Just a couple of things to say in the meantime. We are hoping that some of you will be taking this material to make use of in house groups and in discussions beyond tonight. And the recording is being done in order that will be available for people to use. If you'd like to listen again to the two speeches, and indeed, if you want those to be played at a house group so others can hear them and you can then talk further. Now, in order to assist that, we have prepared two pieces of work, the Bible study material and a study guide, both of which will be available this week from the Sabeel-Kairos website. And the opportunity will be to use those to go deeper into the subject and also to share it with others who might be in house groups during this Lent period. So please do make use of that material. Please do take what's being said tonight to a wider audience in whatever ways we can. With no further ado, we could perhaps move to our question and answer session. We would appreciate it if you could make use of the raise hand facility. The advantage of that is that it brings you to the front of the screen. There is more than one screen of people participating in this call, which we're delighted about. And so therefore we can miss people trying to ask questions if you simply try to wave your hand or indicate from the chat. So if you have a question, if you could please use the raise hand function, and then we can see that you're there ready to do so. We're hoping that you've thought of some questions